Ford, new Focus Fiesta models had flawed transmission and sold them anyway. The car maker says that it's not a safety problem if your car slips into neutral on the highway. So here's an article from the Detroit Free Press at freep.com, and I'll link to this article and some of the other accompanying articles below. What I'm going to do in this video is just go over the article with you guys. No mechanical repairs in this video, unfortunately, because I don't think that this is a problem that is really a DIY solvable thing. It seems that even Ford, as we're going to find out, is not really up to the task of dealing with it. So this is about the dual clutch transmission which Ford developed for the Focus and Fiesta, starting from I think the 2012 year version. It's not an issue for the Mondeo or the Fusion or any of the other Ford cars, but their little small hatchbacks have had many problems over the last nearly decade now. Ford Motor Company knowingly launched two low-priced, fuel-efficient cars with defective transmissions and continued selling the troubled Focus and Fiesta despite thousands of complaints and an avalanche of repairs, a Free Press investigation found. The cars were put on sale in 2010 to 11 as the United States emerged from the Great Recession. At least 1.5 million remain on the road and continue to torment their owners and Ford. Now, this is an American article, so of course this is US-centric. So I don't know if those numbers are referring to just Americans or if they're global. But certainly the Focus and the Fiesta and the drivetrains in them were certainly a global car. In fact, I think they were developed at least partly in Europe. So this is by no means restricted to the US. And I actually have a small amount of personal experience with this because I bought a new car for my mother a few years ago, and because I own a Ford and because I'm vaguely familiar with some of the Ford mechanics and so on, I thought, well, we'll get either a Fiesta or a Focus, and her budget was putting her sort of in this 2011, 2012, 2013 age range, and it's only once I researched those cars that I realized that they had these problems. And we ended up going with Volkswagen. We bought her a Golf, and her Golf has the 7-speed Volkswagen DSG, which is a DCT. But it turns out the Volkswagen had problems earlier with their DCTs as well, but they mostly had resolved them. There are a few issues still remaining, like there was a recall with the what they call the mechatronics box in the Volkswagen. That was the Mark 6 that she ended up buying, the Golf. But mainly those issues had all been resolved by the age of that car. And I love that car. I mean, I think it's been a great choice so far. That it's a 7-speed dual clutch gearbox, and it is phenomenal. I absolutely love driving it. It's the gear shifts are incredible, and despite the fact that it's only a 120 something horsepower motor and it's turboed to get to that, despite the fact that it doesn't have much power on paper, it drives like it has a lot more power than that. I think a lot of it is because the gearbox is just so efficient. It's got the manual clutches, so you don't have the lost efficiency with the automatic torque converter. And in addition to that, it has so many different gears. It's seven speeds, which means that the gearbox just is always able to choose a gear which is the most efficient for the current circumstances. Those DCT gearboxes do have some drawbacks. They behave differently to an automatic gearbox, and I think that causes some problems for drivers who aren't familiar with them, because they're sort of marketed like an automatic gearbox, and the manufacturers they don't want to scare potential customers off, I suppose, by telling them too much up front that, well, you need to sort of relearn your driving style in order to accommodate this new system. And they don't behave like an automatic gearbox because you don't For example, when the car's stopped in drive at an intersection or in traffic or something, you don't have the constant torque that a slush box is providing, which means that when you take your foot off the brake and give it gas, an automatic car will just go straight away. A DCT car will, when you have your foot on the brake, the clutch will be disengaged completely, and it's only once you take your foot off the brake that the car will start to ride the clutch and then apply the clutch fully as you accelerate. And that takes time because you're talking about a mechanical movement, a mechanical clutch which has to be moved and shifted, and then of course the gears themselves the gear train has to be moved around by the mechatronics unit. So all of that takes time, and it means that you have a driving style which is now sort of something between an automatic and a manual car. And but that's okay. I mean, I think that's fine. Once you do get used to it, you just have to be aware that those changes are necessary. In any case, so Volkswagen have sorted out all that, and I think the Volkswagen Audi DCTs now seem to be pretty good. I like them, and they seem to be reasonably mechanically reliable as far as these things go. Ford, oh boy, their first attempt at their dual clutch transmission has not gone well. So the summary of this article says the automaker pushed past company lawyers' early safety questions and a veteran development engineer's warning that the cars were not roadworthy, internal emails and documents show. Ford then declined, after the depth of the problem was obvious, to make an expensive change in the transmission technology. And of course they did. Now there are videos integrated throughout this article. I won't play them because of copyright issues, but if you have the time, I really recommend you go and read this article yourself, and you can watch some of the videos. Instead, the company kept trying to find a fix for the faulty transmission for 5 years while complaints and costs piled up. In the interim, Ford officials prepared talking points for dealers to tell customers that the cars operated normally, when in fact internal documents are peppered with safety concerns and descriptions of the defects. The automaker faces thousands of angry customers, including former loyalists who say they will never buy another Ford, and you can hardly blame them. Maybe they should buy a Volkswagen. Hundreds of millions in repair costs, many times without actually fixing the cars, and litigation so serious the company this spring warned investors of the financial threat posed by defects in what Ford called its DPS6 transmission. So that's the specific one. If you're looking to buy a Ford, it'll be a used Ford at this point. You probably want to avoid them with the DPS6 transmission. To understand what happened, the Free Press reviewed hundreds of pages of internal documents, emails, and court filings from the past decade in which Ford engineers and managers discussed concerns and sought to control damage from the dual-clutch transmission, which enabled the company to tout gas mileage near 40 miles per gallon on the highway. So that's one of the major advantages of a manual transmission. It's you have a more direct transfer of power from the engine to the wheels, because you don't have the torque converter in an automatic transmission spinning hydraulic fluid. And that just means that a automatic transmission will be less efficient than a manual. And these DCTs, although they automatically shift, they are, mechanically speaking, a clutch-driven transmission. So they behave like a manual, and they give you the fuel efficiency. And in addition to that, because they're automated, because they're computer controlled, they can then be tuned for fuel efficiency, above and beyond the way that a manual transmission can be. Now, this gets even more serious than mechanical headaches for people, because the Free Press also analyzed consumer complaints to federal safety officials, finding accounts of 50 previously unreported injuries amid more than 4,300 entries about the unreliable transmissions. No deaths are publicly known to have been linked to the defect, so I suppose that's good. Now, Ford's position, their corporate position, has consistently been that even if the cars slip out of gear while people are driving and they must coast to the side of the road, the cars don't pose a safety risk because power steering, brakes, passenger restraints and other functions continue to work. Ford said to the Free Press in response to this story, they reiterated that vehicles in which DPS-6 was installed were and remain safe. So that's the Ford line. And I can sort of see their point of view. I mean, the fact that the transmission fails doesn't mean that critical safety features of the car, like brakes or power steering, are failing. It's not quite on that order of magnitude of the safety issue. But, you know, there's not going to be much reassurance to you if you own one of these cars, because, as we'll see, some of the testimonies from the owners of these cars are just horrifying. I mean, you have the situation where the cars are just randomly going into neutral, unpredictably, for no reason, in the middle of, you know, any given driving situation on the road. And you don't have to have much driving experience to understand that that's you know, not very good. And it certainly could be a safety issue. I mean, you sometimes need to accelerate as much as you might need to brake in other circumstances. So, no, not good. So, as I say here, others believe the cars are dangerous, including thousands of vehicle owners, a leading consumer safety advocate, and a long-time Ford quality engineer who spoke to the Free Press. Regulators in 2014 conferred with Ford, declined to launch a formal investigation or order a recall. Lawsuits on behalf of US owners allege the company defrauded buyers. Ford denies the allegations, but they did make headlines after settling claims in Australia and Thailand. Now, there was a big class action lawsuit in Australia, in addition to the stuff that's going on in the US. I haven't seen anything major about the UK or Europe, nor any other countries like Canada or New Zealand, where these cars are obviously sold. So it seems that Ford is taking a piecemeal approach and a country-by-country or jurisdiction-by-jurisdiction approach to this, which is unfortunate because it would be nice if Ford on a global basis, you know, issued recalls and just came to the table and dealt with this, because it certainly seems to be doing damage to their brand. So the article then goes into the sort of history of this, and based on the various documents and emails and internal stuff that they have obtained. It's quite long and in depth, and there's various bits and pieces of incriminating evidence, so to say. I won't go into it here because it'll take too long. But again, if you want to get all the gory details, then for sure go and read this. And here are some anecdotes. For example, T-boned in Saginaw. I don't know how to say that, sorry. 8 months later, a Saginaw driver in a 2012 Focus that had been driven only 500 miles reported to federal safety authorities, "I was stopped at a parking lot exit waiting to enter a thoroughfare, engine idling, with my foot lightly on the brake. Suddenly the car accelerated forward into the traffic lane as though someone had pressed the accelerator pedal to the floor. I took a 45 mile per hour T-bone on my driver's side door," because he drove in front of somebody, presumably. And the driver reported that his elderly wife suffered a severe heart bruising from the seatbelt, and he figured he was saved by the airbag. So that's really weird. Like, what's going on there? Because presumably for the car to surge forward, there has to be power applied. The engine has to be revved. So is that just a transmission issue? I'm not sure. I mean, this article doesn't really elaborate on that or go into any more details. So some of these stories are a bit unclear. Carrie Armstrong, Hendersonville, Tennessee. "When I'm on the interstate and almost get hit by a diesel truck just because my car will not accelerate and get into gear," and that's the issue with not being able to accelerate when your drivetrain fails you. So this article's lifting the serious issues, which I suppose they're interested in, the more dramatic stories. But the more sort of mundane issues with these transmissions as they start to fail, so far as I understand it, is that you get a lot of judder in them, and as they get worse, then you'll start to have trouble with them actually changing into gear, so it won't go from neutral. When you put your foot down, nothing happens. The clutch won't engage, or it slips. And as it's going from normal to the sort of failed state, you're going to get a lot of vibration and judder and shaking in the car. It sort of feels like a manual clutch that's being sort of ridden and slipping, instead of it engaging properly and giving you maximum torque. And so far as I understand it from having read about it and having watched some YouTube videos, it's not fixable. I mean, Ford have been doing they've been trying to fix it with software. Nothing's worked. They've been doing, these firmware updates or whatever, and it seems to be a fundamental mechanical problem that is not fixable. It just seems to be a fundamental design flaw. And again, this article doesn't actually go into the technical mechanical details, other than that which you can sort of deduce from some of these statements. Legal filings representing current and former owners claim that their 2012 to 16 Focus and 2011 to 16 Fiestas, so that's the year range to worry about, were prone to shuddering, slipping, bucking, jerking, hesitation while changing gears, premature internal wear, delays in downshifting, and in some cases, sudden or delayed acceleration. So that would make more sense with regard to that earlier anecdote, this delayed acceleration. I think you can imagine somebody wanting to take off from a stop, and they take their foot off the brake and they put their foot on the accelerator, slowly, giving it more and more gas, but nothing happens because the clutch isn't engaging, and they don't know what's happening, so they keep applying gas. And, at this, maybe the engine starts revving up to 3,000, 4,000, even 5,000 RPM. And then maybe suddenly the transmission does dump the clutch. And then, of course, you've got the engine, with halfway to wide open throttle. So what happens at that point? So you could say that's driver error, but of course the car should be not behaving anything like that. That's obviously dangerous. So the Focus and Fiesta equipped with the DPS-6 have been the subject of 18 recalls for a range of defects, but none for transmission repair. Good grief, Ford. What are you doing? This is interesting. Issues increased. Ford's 2012 review showed that things went south from the start. So they knew about this right from the early days. The transmission architecture was selected 12 months later than normal, limiting upfront engineering development time, resulting in, quote, open deliverables at key program milestones, the report said, citing compression of program approval, prototype verification, launch readiness, and mass production. At each early checkpoint, it became more apparent that the transmission systems for the 2011 Fiesta program were not capable to meet customer expectations, the review said. A page was devoted to milestone failures, with 23 red alert issues related to calibration and 115 software changes required before launch for the 2011 Fiesta. Issues increased rather than declined. The 2012 report also said upgrades to the dual clutch system will not be pursued because of an agreement to change technology made in 2011. However, the report says alternatives would delay launch of future model years, add production and factory costs, and reduce fuel economy, creating the risk that Ford could run afoul of federal MPG requirements. And if I was inclined to be political in these videos, I might start to talk about government interference with private companies, but never mind that. The change was not made, and Ford for years continued tweaking the DPS-6, adjusting calibration, clutch materials, and fixing a seal leak. So if you look at various Ford fix transmission videos and stories from since about 2012, you'll find references to those things. But all of them are sort of band-aid fixes. None of them get to the root of the problem. None of them are fundamental fixes. Here are some more quotes from reports from federal regulators. While driving 70 miles an hour, which is about 115 kilometers per hour, the vehicle stalled and lost power, the driver of a 2015 Focus reported to a NHTSA official. As a result, another vehicle crashed into the contact's vehicle in California. A passenger sustained a neck injury, and the driver reported unspecified injuries. New Jersey driver of a 2014 Focus reported while traveling on the highway, the subject vehicle stalled without warning. Despite attempting to restart the vehicle, the driver was unable. The subject vehicle was struck from behind, causing personal injury. Secret crisis manual, and this is about the dealership. Dealership service shops were inundated right away. A Ford transmission manager in Livonia emailed his team in 2012 that 1,400 Focus vehicles had been returned to dealerships with complaints. Ford dealerships were forwarding pages and pages and pages of reports involving the Focus and Fiesta from across the country, chronicling transmission issues and customer frustrations, some even threatening to sue to get action. Bob Thomas in Hamden, Connecticut, reported that the owner of a new Focus loves his vehicle but just wants it to run properly. What an unreasonable request, right? Internal emails show growing distress and urgency in early 2013. This is from a Florida dealership. I'm tired of looking like the bad guy for repairing all these DPS-6 transmissions when, truthfully, Ford's the bad guy here. Let's be honest, Ford produces a horrible product and we trans guys get the wrath of it. My warranty clerk thinks I'm insane, and it's like pulling teeth to get paid for all the work we have to do on these things. The input shaft seals are only good for about 10,000 miles at best, and by replacing them as well as the clutch, the car's only going to return again and again and again. I do 4 or 5 a week on average. I would love to know how Ford intends to fix this. Here's a nice little sort of methodical report. Report to regulators. Ford said its engineers installed a transmission part from a customer's car, a mechatronic actuation module, and this is what happened. Event 1, trans went to neutral at 40 miles per hour, coasted to a side street, re-engaged after sitting for 1 or 2 minutes. Event 2, drove 3 more miles and then turned into a parking lot. Trans went to neutral while driving, stopped vehicle, shifted to park, shifter then became locked in park. After a few minutes, was able to shift out of park and re-engage. Event 3, driving in the same parking lot, trans went to neutral, re-engaged after a minute or so. Event 4, drove on the road for 1 mile, trans went to neutral, coasted to parking lot, shut the engine off, waited 20 minutes, started engine light was still on, drove on highway, trans was shifting in and out of neutral, drove 5 miles. After several miles at 60 miles per hour, trans went to neutral, coasted to the shoulder, shifted to park, turned the engine off, immediately restarted and re-engaged. Drove a couple more miles and exited the interstate. On the exit ramp, trans went to neutral, stayed in neutral, shifted to park, turned engine off, restarted and re-engaged. Drove back to the Ford parking lot. Just, can you imagine owning this car? I mean, my God. $3 billion headache. So this is about the cost to Ford, of course, and the litigation. Pending U.S. lawsuits include a class action case based in federal court in Los Angeles covering 1.9 million owners and former owners. A Michigan-based mass action filed in Wayne County, bought by 12,300 buyers who have opted out of the class action. 970 individual lawsuits across the country. 110 coordinated lawsuits across the country bundled together in California. Lawyers who have negotiated with Ford say the company has offered settlements of more than $75,000 to individual plaintiffs in California, which is known for its strong consumer protection laws. They note Ford has lost its only trial to date on the matter in California with a judgment of more than $700,000. The company conceded liability of more than $145,000 in damages, but challenged a fraud claim but lost. Overseas, so this is about Australia, Ford paid a fine of 10 million Australian dollars to the Australian government for the, quote, unconscionable mistreatment of consumers, blaming them as bad drivers. And you saw examples of that earlier when they complained of transmission issues. This is from Australia. Ford knew the symptoms of the quality issues with the vehicles were experienced intermittently, but required customers to demonstrate them on demand in the presence of a dealer in order for repairs to be undertaken, Australian Competition and Consumer Commission chairman said in April 2016. And of course, that's a lot easier said than done because these sorts of things they're sort of random, unpredictable, not necessarily repeatable on demand. If you own one of these cars, then they do seem to differ by year. I mean, as much as the transmission design itself is generally terrible, the 2012 Ford Focus was a particularly bad one. For example, if we look at this American graph from the NHTSA, complaints to the Traffic Safety Administration for the Ford Focus shot up with the 2012 model year, which is when the transmission was first used in the car. But after that, they actually decline, as you can see. So by the time red here is the Focus, and They're really bad in the first few years, but in the 2015 and 16 years, which were the last 2 years that it used that transmission, not too bad actually. I mean, so if you own one of those cars and you are not having major problems, then maybe don't panic. This relates just to the transmission. So again, you can see the first 3 years of the Focus and the first sort of 3 or 4 years of the Fiesta were pretty bad, but then the last 2 years they did seem to manage to patch things up. So isn't that interesting? And let's just do one other thing here. Ford stock price. Let's see what this looks like. Let's put this to 5 years, and oh dear. So that'll be enough of that. I'll put the links to the articles below, and I really do recommend that you have a read of them, especially if you own one of these cars. And if you do own one of these cars, then tell me your story. I'd like to hear about it. And if you have been dealing with Ford, or you've gotten any compensation from Ford, or you're involved in any sort of litigation with Ford, especially outside the US, I'd like to hear from people in the UK. What are you guys doing? Let me know. And this is the sort of thing where you letting other talking about it in a public forum, so to say, it could be very helpful to other people who are researching this sort of thing. If somebody's inadvertently bought one of these cars secondhand without knowing problems with them, not everybody does a huge amount of research before they get sold a car by a car dealership, for example. So there's lots of these cars out there, and they're not obviously all going to be scrapped and junked. So yeah, let's discuss it. Right. Well, if you do own one of these cars, I'm not sure how helpful that was, and I'm sure you're not having too much fun with it. But anyway, see you next time.